Okay, picture this. A place continuously lived in since the last ice age. We're talking over 30,000 years.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-boggling. That's Switzerland. Right beneath your feet, basically.
For a country we think of as so modern, that depth of history is just,
Wow.
wow.
And what's really remarkable, I think, is those earliest people. They faced huge climate changes, right? But they survived.
How?
Well, adaptability, ingenuity. You could almost say that resilience is baked into Swiss history from the very beginning. It's sort of a theme.
That's a great way to put it. And today on the Deep Dive, that's exactly what we're doing, tracing that long, fascinating story of Switzerland.
We've pulled together a whole range of sources. The idea is to pull out the really key insights.
Kind of a shortcut for you, the listener, to get a handle on how this really unique country developed, from way back then right up to today's complexities.
Yeah, the goal is a clear picture, engaging, hit the big moments, maybe some surprising tunes, but without getting totally bogged down in dates and names.
We want to connect the dots for you. So whether you're just curious or maybe you know a bit already and want to go deeper, we've got you covered. We'll track the big periods chronologically.
Right, the formation of the Confederation, the Reformation, a huge impact there, the World Wars.
All of it. Okay, let's start way back. Prehistoric Switzerland, 30,000 years. I mean, what can we really know about that time?
Well, it's like detective work, isn't it? It draws on lots of different sciences.
Like archaeology.
Archaeology, definitely, finding settlements, tools, but also geology to understand the landscape back then. And paleontology, biology. They tell us about the plants, the animals, even the climate they were dealing with. It's piecing it all together.
And then, okay, jump forward a bit. Around 10,000 years ago, something massive happens. Agriculture arrives.
Oh, absolutely fundamental shift. Yeah.
Thus it changed everything.
It did. Suddenly you've got cultivation, wild grains, grapes, flax, and domestication of animals. Sheep, goats, pigs. That's the Neolithic kicking in.
And the consequences.
Well, you see this cascade, right? More stable food probably means better living standards, maybe population growth. And interestingly, we start seeing signs of people specializing in different jobs. Division of labor.
A real turning point. How people lived in that landscape.
Definitely.
Okay, let's leap forward again, quite a big leap, to the Romans. The sources talk about the Helvetii, 1st century BC, and Caesar.
That's the one. The Helvetii were a major group living in what's now Switzerland, and they tried this big migration.
Which didn't end well for them.
No, Caesar defeated them. And that defeat essentially pulls the region into the Roman sphere, into Roman provinces.
So just absorbed into the empire?
Well, yes and no. It seems it wasn't quite a uniform Roman blanket. The sources mention the Cisalpine provinces, even under Roman rule, kept a fair bit of self-governance, so it's a bit more nuanced than just conquest.
That is interesting. And the sources kind of contrast the Romans with the Helvetii, describing the Helvetii society as, serene and orderly, temples, festivals.
Right. It suggests that while the Romans brought their roads, their Latin, their administration, they were also meeting established societies with their own ways.
Not just barbarians.
Exactly. And there's a hint that the Romans, they appreciated the landscape too, the beauty of it. Think of the mountain passes. They built fortresses there. Strategic, yes, but shows they were present and interacting with the environment.
Okay, so Roman power eventually wanes. We move into the Middle Ages, and this is where we really start to see Switzerland taking shape, right? These alliances.
Precisely. It starts quite organically. In the early Middle Ages, different communities, cantons, start forming these loose defensive pacts for mutual protection.
And the famous ones are Uri, Nidwalden, and Schwyz.
That's the core, yeah. And that Treaty of Eternal Alliance in 1291, that's widely seen as the foundational moment, the birth certificate, if you like.
Then there's another treaty mentioned, 1315, the Treaty of Federation, and a victory over the Habsburgs around then.
Absolutely. That victory was huge. It really showed these alliances worked, it solidified things, and probably encouraged others to join.
So the Confederation grew.
It did, gradually.
Right.
Over the next couple of centuries, you see cantons like Bernay joining, Soleure, Freiburg. But what's key is, even as it grew a bit, the individual cantons held on to a lot of their own power. Their autonomy actually increased.
So it wasn't becoming like France or England, a single centralized kingdom.
Not at all. The old Swiss Confederation was really decentralized. Think of it as a network, a collection of independent states bound by treaties, mostly about defense.
Each canton running its own show. Domestic policy, foreign policy, army.
Pretty much, yeah. They governed themselves.
But they must have had some way to coordinate.
They did. There was the Diet, the Tagsatzung. It was like a common assembly. Delegates from all the cantons met, usually once a year, to sort out stuff that affected everyone, like war, peace, major treaties.
And within the cantons, city councils.
Yeah, typically city councils ran things, often with different levels, like great councils, small councils, special committees for specific tasks. The sources suggest by 1515, this phase of territorial growth for the old Confederation basically stops.
Right. And right around that time, early 1500s, Europe gets hit by the Reformation. Switzerland's smack in the middle.
Oh, absolutely. It takes root there in the 1520s. And a big driver was the printing press, getting pamphlets, reformist ideas out there really fast.
And the authorities noticed.
You bet they did. They quickly saw this wasn't just about religion. It had major political implications. How territories were governed, who held power.
The sources mention this idea of a master-like past building identity, like the stories of the Confederation's founding, those early military wins.
Exactly. There was already this sense of shared history, shared struggle. And the Reformation's core ideas, wanting a pure church, free from corruption, really struck a chord in that context.
The Zurich Communion dispute is mentioned as a key event.
Yeah, that was Zwingli. It boiled down to fundamental questions. What does communion actually mean? Especially after reformers started pointing out what they saw as corruption in the Catholic Mass.
And there was a public debate, Zwingli arguing his case.
On Easter morning, apparently. Very dramatic, a direct challenge. And it led to this big theological shift, thinking about communion less as a physical thing and more as an inner spiritual experience. Immersion of the soul, as one source puts it. And these weren't just local squabbles in Zurich. These debates spread. Zwingli was involved elsewhere, too, like in Bern, arguing with other reformers, even Lutheran princes. It was a ferment of ideas.
Okay, so from religious upheaval, we shift gears into the Enlightenment. And it seems Switzerland's unusual political setup really caught people's eye then.
It really did. Think about it. This collection of cantons, alliances, not quite a single state, not quite a standard federation. It didn't fit the usual boxes.
It was an anomaly.
Exactly. And that made Enlightenment thinkers sit up and take notice. It challenged their ideas about what a nation or a state should be.
Especially the language thing, right? Multiple languages in one small country. That flew in the face of the whole one nation, one language idea that was gaining ground.
Absolutely. So Switzerland became this sort of living laboratory for debates about sovereignty, about citizenship, about how diverse peoples could live together.
The sources use this phrase, negative but seductive utopical quality.
Yeah, meaning its long history of pluralism seemed to offer this possibility. Maybe you could have order and freedom without them canceling each other out.
Yeah.
It resonated with people looking for alternative ways to organize society. Think of the American founders, maybe. The Swiss multiple imperium, sovereign cantons in a loose structure. It was just different, paradoxical.
Then along comes Napoleon, 1798. Sounds like he shook things up considerably.
Oh, big time. Bonaparte saw this loose structure and, well, he interfered, sent agents in to stir up disputes between cantons. Then he comes along and suggests, why not have a unified democratic system? Modeled on France, of course.
And that leads to the Helvetian Republic.
Yes. Established July 1798, very much under French influence, French military might.
They got a constitution?
They did, the Helvetian Constitution. But it didn't really stick. It was pretty short-lived, replaced by another assembly that wasn't even constitutional.
So resistance.
Lots of it. People didn't like this imposed system. So Napoleon sends in more troops. France ends up basically controlling Swiss laws, administration. It was a period of major upheaval, revolts popping up all over the place.
Quite a contrast to the Switzerland we often imagine. But maybe that stable image starts to form later with the federal state of 1848. That feels like a really crucial moment.
It absolutely is a major turning point. The 1848 Constitution creates a much stronger federal structure. You get the executive branch, the federal council, the legislature, the federal assembly, and an independent federal court. Clear separation of powers.
And it was mostly the German-speaking Swiss who drafted it.
Primarily, yes. That reflected the demographics at the time. And it was a big shift away from the idea that the cantons were supreme. The federal level got significant lawmaking powers.
The sources mention things like the assembly being able to revise the Constitution, the independent judiciary. Key features.
Definitely key modern features, though the sources also point out some early issues, some gray areas, like what was the exact status of the cantons now? And the federal army was strictly under national control, which was new.
But it passed.
Yes, popular vote approved it in September 48, came into effect in December. It was a massive step towards the Switzerland we know. Then came the task of taking existing cantonal laws, translating them, adapting them, bringing them into line with this new federal reality. A huge amount of legislative work.
Okay, so political consolidation happens. Then industrialization.
Oh.
But the Swiss experience was a bit different, wasn't it?
It seems so. Before industry, Switzerland was mostly agricultural. Society was relatively flat, you could say. Industrialization brought the usual class divisions, sure, but the drive behind it early on, the sources suggest it was less about individual profit and more this kind of patriotic push, a desire to modernize the nation.
And they had that history of guilds in the cities, right?
Yeah.
Regulating trade and crafts.
Exactly. A strong tradition of skilled work, organized labor. And crucially, Switzerland didn't have huge amounts of coal or iron, the typical resources driving industry elsewhere.
So they had to specialize.
Pretty much. They leaned into industries needing skilled labor, innovation, high added value, which eventually leads to that large service sector we see today, banking, insurance.
Insurance got a boost from wars, apparently.
Yeah, conflict, sadly, often creates a need for insurance that seems to have played a role in the growth of that sector.
Speaking of conflict, World War I. Switzerland's neutral, but it wasn't unaffected.
No, definitely not. And historians now look beyond just Switzerland staying out. They look at the organizational strain, the effort to maintain national unity, how Switzerland interacted with the warring nations. Maintaining that neutrality was a massive federal undertaking.
The sources have some really striking descriptions, almost surreal. Being so close to the fighting that impotence unbearable.
Yeah, you get that sense. Officially neutral, but surrounded by this massive, bloody conflict. Even comments attributed to figures like Wilson about the cataclysmic stupidity of recognizing certain powers show the intense pressure cooker Switzerland was in.
And maintaining neutrality wasn't easy or cheap.
No. Described as repugnant, expensive if humanizing, it highlights the really difficult balancing act involved.
Then the interwar years. Still neutral, but new challenges emerge.
Right. Switzerland tried to make economic hay from its WWI neutrality, but the interwar period brings new tensions. Domestically, there's a rethinking of the 1918 national strike, seeing it more as a sign of deep social inequality and political divides.
And externally.
Externally, the big thing is the rise of Nazism next door. That created huge political debates within Switzerland about how to relate to Germany.
But it wasn't isolated, despite the neutrality.
Not at all. Still deeply tied into the global economy. And it was even a place for international peace efforts, like that Socialist Congress in Basel back in 1912. Internally, you see the government taking extraordinary powers at the start of WWI, granting the executive unrestricted authority. That shows how seriously they took the situation.
And tourism continued. Davos, Montreux.
Yeah, those places, already popular for health tourism, kind of adapted during the war, and Basel apparently gained this sort of mystique city reputation during WWII.
Which brings us to World War II itself. Again, neutrality, but under incredibly different, darker circumstances.
Hugely different. Initially, maybe Switzerland seemed like this rich, peaceful oasis, strong army as a deterrent. But as the war escalated, the sheer scale of destruction and the Holocaust happening all around, it inevitably cast a shadow.
And after the war, that idyllic image started to get questioned, especially around things like bank accounts.
Exactly. The issue of dormant accounts belonging to Holocaust victims brought intense scrutiny. This led to the whole Sonderfall Schweiz discussion, Switzerland's special case, and a real questioning of that neutrality myth. Was it really so pure?
Which led to that commission in the 90s.
Yes. The government set up the International Commission of Experts in 1996, a major effort to confront that complex wartime history head-on.
Okay, after the war, Europe's rebuilding, Switzerland's economy is relatively okay, but not totally untouched.
Right. It wasn't devastated like others, and revenues were generally up. But there were costs, obligations, fluctuations in the national bank's dealings, especially related to Germany. But overall, yeah, a lot of wealth returned after 45. Inflation was lower than in the U.S., for instance. Swiss banking secrecy remained a powerful factor.
Thinking about Switzerland in Europe more broadly, the sources call it an anomaly. Why?
Well, several things. Partly that historical element. A segment of the population maybe didn't feel deeply connected to wider European culture or economy in the same way. Then there's that paradox. Strong defense and promoting disarmament.
And the languages, obviously.
The languages, absolutely. 4 national languages in such a compact space. One source even provocatively suggests the Swiss aren't really a single race, but are kind of artificially held together by these different tongues and cultures.
Yet despite that description, modern Switzerland is often held up as a success story for managing diversity. 4 languages: German, French, Italian, Romansh.
It is, yeah. German, French, Italian got official status back in 1848. Romansh came later in 1938. And the system is interesting. Federal government sets the overall policy, but it's the cantons that actually implement it on the ground.
The Constitution talks about multilingualism, but the sources suggest the reality is more like bilingualism in practice.
That's a really important distinction. Officially, it's quadrilingual, but because of the territoriality principle, meaning the local language dominates in a specific region, many areas function as monolingual day to day.
Plus other factors pushing towards German and French being more dominant nationally.
Right, so you end up with the situation de jure quadrilingual, but de facto often bilingual, especially at the national level. It creates what linguists call diglossia. The sources call Switzerland a haphazard facies, a place where these competing principles just coexist.
Which loops back to neutrality. It seems so central to the Swiss identity, more than just policy.
Yeah, definitely. It's become part of the national story, the ethos. It's a way to manage internal diversity in a small country, perhaps. And historically, given how hard it would be to defend its borders effectively, neutrality was also just pragmatic statecraft, survival.
It's described as neutrality of mind, of policy, of diplomacy, and of goodwill.
That's the ideal, yes. And incidents like the Ling Affair in the 1850s, where a perceived slip from neutrality caused trouble, really reinforced how important it was considered. The understanding of it has evolved, for sure, but it's still fundamental.
Okay, let's shift to the environment. Mountainous country, diverse ecosystems.
Yeah.
What are the priorities there?
Well, given the landscape, preserving biodiversity is huge. Protecting rare habitats, endangered species, that's a core principle. Maintaining forests, tackling water pollution, climate change, adhering to international agreements is key. But the forests are under pressure. Climate change, definitely. But also international trade, bringing in new pests and diseases.
Yeah.
How forests are managed is changing too. So there's a need for new ways of governing these resources, more transparent, more inclusive policies.
And Switzerland's role in international organizations, it's been a bit cautious.
Cautious is a good word. Famously, the voters rejected joining the UN back in the late 40s, even though the cantons were mostly for it.
But they joined eventually.
Yes, finally, in 2002. Public opinion shifted. They had applied to the ILO much earlier, 1920, but got knocked back by the UN then. They're part of the International Court of Justice statute, but haven't accepted automatic jurisdiction.
Yet Geneva hosts so many organizations.
Yeah, exactly. It's a paradox. A major hub for the UN, ILO, WHO, etc., even while the country itself held back from full membership for a long time. They have participated in things like the Yugoslavia conferences, sent people to the Hague Tribunal, but always navigating that neutrality. The Guerrero abduction case, for instance, highlighted some complexities in Swiss-US relations related to this.
Okay, tourism. Another big one for Switzerland's image and economy. How did that develop so successfully?
It's a great success story, starting really strongly in the later 19th century, say after 1865. It built on earlier travel trends, sure, but also on Switzerland's modernization drive from the mid-1800s.
Skills played a part.
Huge part. Skills in construction, think mountain railways, hotels, transport infrastructure, hospitality training and higher education, strong international links. And the state helped too, consolidating the rail network, managing foreign relations.
One source mentions necropolitics, managing the landscape for tourists.
Yeah, it's a striking term. Basically, the idea of actively preserving or even shaping landscapes, maybe keeping things looking traditional or picturesque, specifically to meet tourist expectations. Conserving a particular image of the place.
Looking broadly now, summing up Swiss contributions and themes from, say, 1815 onwards.
You could use keywords, maybe. Federalism, definitely.
Yeah.
Democracy, evolving. Neutrality, obviously. Social federalism, sharing responsibilities. Humanitarianism is huge. Decentralization.
The Congress of Vienna saw Switzerland as this moderate island.
Right. And while neutrality aged, maybe became more complex, Switzerland leaned into being a peace arbitrator. Think Geneva Conventions, Red Cross, UNESCO links. On the domestic front, sometimes progress on social issues was slow during peaceful times. But things like the Swiss Civil Code from 1862 are major, long-lasting legal achievements.
But modern Switzerland faces challenges too. Immigration is a big one mentioned.
Yes. particularly the large waves in the late 50s and 60s. That brought challenges of adaptation, integration. The sources note that while the rate wasn't necessarily extreme compared to elsewhere, the difficulty in getting citizenship and the origin of many immigrants from less developed countries were significant factors.
Leading to some anxieties.
Fears among some Swiss, yes, about cultural distance, about whether immigrants intended to stay permanently, about employment patterns. It's also mentioned as impacting gender balance in some areas and leading to commuting patterns and some ethnic segregation in suburbs. Complex social dynamics.
And other social issues. Tensions.
Yeah, despite cooperation, there have been ongoing tensions. Historical class divides lingered, maybe worsened by reactions to that 1918 strike. There's been questioning of state power, the relationship between state, media, economy. But values have also shifted a lot, which you see in census data, surveys. People started debating social issues more openly, more pluralistically, rather than just reacting to single disasters. The way the government studies attitudes to Social Security shows this evolution.
And the languages and cultures, we touched on this, but the Constitution aims for equality. Has it worked?
The 1848 Constitution set the stage, recognizing German, French, Italian initially, without even strictly defining language. That flexibility allowed it to evolve. Romansh was added later. The goal became this near-ideal equality, seeing them all as national languages, languages of fellow citizens. Initially, it was partly about correcting historical advantages French had.
But challenges remain.
Yes, despite the constitutional ideal, economic gaps and practical language barriers persist. Achieving true equality across the board is an ongoing process.
Lastly, a quick look at education, research, healthcare.
Education sees growing differences between cantons, but core things like language learning, civics, gender education are generally accepted. History teaching, especially WWII and the Holocaust, has become much more prominent. Research is incredibly varied and deep, lots of archives. Though maybe access and understanding of those archives, connecting them to education about the Nazi past, could be better. Healthcare is decentralized, 26 different cantonal systems, but universal access via mandatory insurance since '96. Coverage is broad, but it's expensive, among the highest spending in the OECD.
And challenges there.
Aging population, more chronic illness. That means rising demand for long-term care. So there's pressure to improve coordination, accountability, maybe rethink how care is organized to keep it sustainable and patient-focused.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear Switzerland's story is incredibly rich. Ancient roots, Roman layers, forging that unique confederation, the Reformation's impact, Enlightenment ideas, navigating wars through neutrality, managing diversity. It's a lot.
And that interplay between memory and identity is so powerful. How Switzerland constructed this positive self-image after WWII, often by being selective, and then how that narrative got challenged later, leading to real national soul-searching in the 90s.
It wasn't just what history was remembered, but who was doing the remembering and how they interpreted it.
Exactly. The whole framework shifted.
Well, thank you for joining us on this exploration of Swiss history.
It really is fascinating how a nation built from such different linguistic and cultural pieces managed to forge such a strong, distinct identity.
It definitely makes you think, doesn't it? How does any country square its preferred self-image with a more complicated, maybe less comfortable past? And are there lessons there for other diverse societies navigating their own journeys? Something to ponder.